This presentation is an introduction to what we call the early Renaissance, roughly the 1400s. We're coming to a time period that we just call the Renaissance. The 1400s and 1500s in Western Europe. Traditionally, we divided into the early Renaissance, the higher Renaissance, and the northern Renaissance, and that's the pattern we're going to be following in this course. We've come across this word Renaissance before when we talked about the Carolingian Renaissance. So by now you know that word Renaissance means a rebirth. When we talked about the Carolingian Renaissance, it was obvious what the rebirth was, the rebirth of literacy, the rebirth of reading and writing in Western Europe after those dark ages. But when we come to this time period that we call the Renaissance, the 1400s and 1500s, what exactly is being reborn? Well, I'm not sure there's a really good answer to the question. It's a fair question. Lots of books have been written about exactly what is being reborn in the Renaissance, and I'm not sure there's a really good answer to the question. What is more than one thing that's being reborn is that a lot of people at the time called their own time period the Renaissance. You see, after all the bad stuff we've been talking about for the last few lectures, the fall of Rome, the collapse of civilization, the Dark Ages, the barbarian invasions, bubonic plague, after all that bad stuff, it's like there's a sense of optimism in the culture, that the culture has turned the corner, that the future is bright. There's a sense of optimism. And a lot of people writing about this feeling of enthusiasm and excitement about the future refer to their own time period as a renaissance, as a rebirthing. And I think that's more interesting than coming up with one answer to the question, what exactly is being reborn? But that there's a sense of excitement and enthusiasm and creativity and optimism looking towards the future. There's just a few scattered facts about the early Renaissance that you have to keep in mind to make sense out of the stuff we'll be looking at that comes out of the early Renaissance. For one thing, the big center of activity in Western Europe in the 1400s is a city in Italy called Florence. That's the big happening place in the 15th century, the 1400s, in Western Europe. Florence, Italy, is the big center of the banking industry, the big center of espionage, the center of diplomacy, is the academic center. The University of Florence is the big university in the 1400s. It's the big happening place to be in Western Europe in the 1400s. Today it's not much of a happening place. It's a nice tourist attraction, but people who go to Florence go there to see stuff from the 1400s because that's when it was the big happening place. In our world history course, we talk about why Florence becomes the big center of activity in Western Europe in the 1400s. For us in this course, we're just kind of noticing it. When we look at things that come out of the early Renaissance in this class, everything that we're going to be talking about in these online presentations on the early Renaissance either come out of the city of Florence or from a day's walk from the city of Florence. The other little piece of information to know is that in the 1400s, for most of the 1400s, Florence is under the control of one family, and that's a family called the Medici family. In a world history course, we have a lot to say about the Medici family. They run the government in Florence, they run the diplomatic corps, they run the banking industry, they run the banking industry. If you drive past a pawn shop in town, there's usually either a sign or even an actual thing standing out with three red balls in like a triangular shape. That comes from the coat of arms of the Medici family. Early banks used to be kind of like pawn shops, and today pawn shops honor the Medici family by showing their coat of arms on their sign or somehow. They run the shipping industry in the Mediterranean Sea. I mean, this is the big powerful family in Florence. And because Florence is the big happening place, this is the big powerful family in Western Europe. Members of the family marry into all the royal families of Europe. A handful of members of the family become popes. They'll be very influential in the church. And so, in a world history course, we'd say an awful lot about the Medici family. For us, we just notice that they're there. They're going to come up a few times in the lectures. And then there's one other little piece of information you need to know to be able to figure out the stuff we're going to be looking at in the early Renaissance and actually for several centuries afterwards. That's an economic system, an economic relationship, what's called the patronage system. It's a very simple system to understand. It won't confuse you at all. Well, there's only one part that might confuse you, but when we get to it, we'll make sure that you understand and it won't confuse you. It's a very simple system. It's a relationship between two people. One of these people we call the patron. The patron is the rich guy. The patron has a lot of money, and the patron wants to hire a professional to do a job. In other words, wants to hire a client. Wants to hire a client to do a job. So the patronage system is a relationship between these two people, a patron and a client. Again, the patron is the rich guy. He wants something done, so he's going to hire a professional to do it. Now, it could be any of the professions. It could be that he wants to hire an architect to design a home for himself, or he wants to hire a medical doctor to perform a surgery on a family member. There's all kinds of different professions out there, but because we're going to be looking at the visual arts, I'm going to use the word artist here, but it really could be any professional. The patron wants to hire an artist. Let's say the patron says, I want a sculpture made that I want to donate to the local church. I want it to be carved in white marble. I want it to be an image of Mary holding baby Jesus and baby Jesus sitting on Mary's right knee. I want it to be good size, about 4.5 foot long, and he writes out exactly what he wants the sculpture to look like. Artists in the area who hear about this submit an application packet. They submit recommendations and sketches of what they think the sculpture might look like, lists of previous contests that they've won, because then the patron announces a contest. And he writes up exactly what he wants to look like, and then the artists who hear about that contest enter the contest. That's what I'm getting at here. They send in the application packet with sketches of what they think the sculpture might look like and that kind of thing. As these sketches come in, they're typically posted in Town Hall down in Florence. And ordinary people like you and me stop by and we look at them, we argue about who we think is going to win. We might make bets on who we think is going to win. Well, on the day of the contest, the patron or a panel of judges that the patron has appointed announce the winner of the contest. And in an elaborate ceremony, usually on the front steps of City Hall in Florence, the patron and the client sign a contract. And it outlines exactly what the piece is going to look like, and there's a payment schedule. As this part of the job is done, this part of money is passed over, until at the end of the payout schedule, then the patron owns the sculpture and the artist has the money. And that's it. It's a simple system to understand. Just some things to point out to you. In this relationship, who's controlling what's being produced? Well, that's the patron, because the patron has the money. The artist certainly can make a sculpture out of, let's just say, gray marble. But if the contract calls for white marble, well, then there's going to be a dispute over whether the artist has fulfilled the contract or not. So the patron is the one who controls what's being produced. The short way of saying that is follow the money, right? Follow the money. The patron is the one who has the power. The other thing to notice is that the big player in the patronage system in Florence in the 1400s is the Medici family, because they've got an awful lot of money. They're going to spend an awful lot of money on the arts, on architecture, on civil engineering. They're going to be the major players in the patronage system. And as we look at stuff that comes out of the 1400s in these online presentations, with only one exception, I think, everything we're going to be looking at is done as patronage pieces for the Medici family. The only other thing that might confuse you, and just to make sure it doesn't confuse you, is now I'm confusing myself. There we go. The only thing that might confuse you is the use of the word client here, because that word client has changed its meaning over time and now has come to mean almost the exact opposite of what the use of the word we're using here. All you had to do is remember that the client is the one who's doing the work. The client is doing the work. And if you remember that, then the rest of the system is easy. Well, that's just some scattered facts here that it helps to have in mind as we look at some of the stuff that comes out of the early Renaissance.